The sky over Seoul was a bruised purple, heavy with the weight of an impending storm that refused to break. Jin-ho, the man the underworld whispered about as the Silent Reaper, looked nothing like a harvester of souls today. He was a man hollowed out, a shell of the titan who had once commanded the Gangnam districts with a single icy glance. His immaculate black suit, tailored to project power, was now stained with the damp, clucking earth of a fresh grave. He was on his knees, his forehead pressed against the cold mirror-sheen granite that bore the name Aisha, a name that had been his only prayer in a life of sin. The luxury leather of his shoes, worth more than a soldier's life, was caked in cemetery mud as he gasped for air. His breath came in ragged, hitching gasps that tore at his throat, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated despair that echoed off the surrounding stone mausoleums. He gripped the grass of the mound with trembling fingers, his knuckles white, as if he could physically reach through the dirt and pull her back from the abyss. To anyone who knew his reputation, this display of raw vulnerability was a paradox. He was the iron fist of the syndicate, yet here, stripped of his lieutenants and his mask of indifference, he was merely a husband whose heart had been ripped from his chest. 50 yards away, concealed within the dense, drooping shadows of an ancient weeping willow, Aisha watched him. She stood on trembling legs, her hand pressed violently over her mouth to stifle a sob that threatened to betray her presence. She was dressed in the heavy mourning veils of a civilian, an anonymous ghost in a denim jacket that hid the woman who had once been a queen. For 48 hours, she had lived in the freezing grip of betrayal, convinced that Jin-ho was the architect of her destruction, the man who had ordered the poison that mimicked a cerebral hemorrhage. She had come to this grave expecting to find a man satisfied with his work, or perhaps a man already moving on to his next conquest. Instead, she witnessed a transformation that came too late. The sight of the Silent Reaper reduced to a puddling mess of grief shattered her own resolve. Every sob he let out was a testament to a love she had doubted, a love he had repressed under the guise of protecting her from his world. The realization washed over her with the force of a tidal wave. He didn't know. He wasn't her executioner. He was the primary victim of a coup she was only beginning to understand. As Jin-ho let out a final, broken roar of anguish, whispering to the earth that it should have been him instead, Aisha felt her own heart break anew. She wanted to run to him, to wipe the mud from his face, and tell him the death he was mourning was a miracle of survival. But as she scanned the perimeter, her eyes, once warm and full of light, hardened into flint. She knew that to reveal herself now would be a death sentence for them both. The killers, the true architects of this tragedy, were likely watching, waiting for his grief to make him careless so they could slide a knife between his ribs. She had to remain a ghost a little while longer. She had to be the weapon he didn't know he had. The memory of their life together felt like a fever dream. It's a kaleidoscope of gold-leafed ceilings and the suffocating scent of expensive lilies that had always filled their penthouse. To the outside world, Aisha was the jewel of the Silent Reaper's crown, living in a sanctuary of glass and marble that overlooked the Han River. But as she stood in the shadows of the cemetery, she remembered that sanctuary for what it truly was, a gilded cage. Jin-ho had built those walls under the vow of protection, swearing to keep the blood and the violence of the syndicate outside their doors. But in doing so, he had locked her away from his soul. In the early years of their marriage, the luxury had been a distraction. She remembered the nights he would return home, smelling of expensive cologne and the faint, metallic tang of iron that he tried to wash away before touching her. He would drape her in jewels and silks, yet his eyes remained distant, always scanning the horizon for the next threat. To Jin-ho, love was a vulnerability, a target painted on his chest, and his response was to treat Aisha like a delicate artifact to be guarded rather than a partner to be trusted. Every time she asked about the whispers in the hallways or the sudden disappearance of a lieutenant, he would silence her with a kiss that tasted of iron and secrets, telling her it was for her own safety. That protection had begun to feel like betrayal. While he moved through the world as a god of the underworld, she was a ghost in her own home, her sharp intellect and survival instincts dismissed as softness that needed shielding. She had become a foreigner in his life, a distraction that the syndicate elders viewed with growing resentment. So Jinho believed that by keeping her in the dark, he was keeping her alive. But he never realized that the darkness was where she was most capable of standing beside him. She recalled the last dinner they shared, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken tension that no vintage wine could drown. He had spoken of legitimacy and going clean, ideas she had planted in his head during their rare moments of intimacy. She had seen the flicker of hope in his eyes, but she had also seen the predatory glares of Kenji and Hannah from across the room. Men who saw her influence not as love, but as a toxin turning a tiger into a house cat. Jinho had been blind to the daggers being sharpened behind his back because he was too busy watching the front door for her sake. Now, watching him weep over a pile of dirt, Aisha realized the tragic irony of their marriage. He had tried to protect her from the world, but he hadn't protected her from the people he called family. He had kept her a secret from his enemies, only to make her a target for his friends. The sanctuary was gone, burned to ash on a highway bridge, and as the rain finally began to fall, Aisha knew she could never go back to being the woman in the cage. If she was to save the man who had failed to save her, she would have to embrace the very darkness he had tried so hard to hide. The betrayal had tasted like bitter almonds in her morning tea, a sharp, metallic tang that preceded the slow-motion collapse of her world. Within minutes of that final, quiet breakfast, a creeping paralysis had claimed Aisha's limbs, locking her muscles while her mind remained a screaming prisoner behind unblinking eyes. She had been conscious for all of it. The frantic, staged race to the hospital, the somber faces of the doctors, and the cold, clinical silence of the morgue. To the world and to the man currently shattering at her grave, Aisha Park had suffered a sudden, tragic aneurysm, a freak medical tragedy that no amount of syndicate power could prevent. But death was a masquerade. The poison in her veins was a precise tetrodotoxin mix, a chemical veil designed to slow the heart to a rhythm so imperceptible it fooled even the most advanced monitors. As she lay on the stainless steel slab, a tag tied to her toe, and a white sheet pulled over her face, she had heard the voices of her executioners. She had heard the conspirators, Kenji and Hannah, laughing in the hall, discussing how easy it had been to remove the foreign distraction and how pathetically Jinho would crumble in her absence. In those frozen hours, the silence of the morgue was broken by the sound of her own heart breaking. She believed Jinho had finally tired of her, that he had chosen the purity of his empire over the complication of their love. She had been saved by a ghost from her own past. The coroner, a man whose gambling debts Aisha had secretly cleared years ago, had moved with the frantic energy of a man paying off a soul debt. He had swapped her body for an unclaimed Jane Doe just moments before the embalming process was scheduled to begin, injecting the antidote into her jugular with a trembling hand. When the air finally rushed back into her lungs, it felt like swallowing glass. She had woken up in the back of a refrigerated delivery van, alive but orphaned by the world she knew. For 48 hours, Aisha had stayed hidden in a safe house the size of a closet, watching the news of her own funeral through a cracked phone screen. She had been convinced that Jinho was the architect of her destruction, the one who had finally decided that the tiger shouldn't have a house cat. She had planned to flee the country, to vanish into the anonymity of the global sprawl and leave the silent reaper to his blood-soaked throne. But a final, masochistic urge had driven her to the cemetery. She needed to see him one last time, to witness the face of the man who had supposedly traded her life for a kingdom. Standing behind the ancient willow, she had prepared herself to see a man of stone. Instead, she found a man in the mud. Seeing his agony, Witnessing the raw, unscripted destruction of his composure, the truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. He didn't know. He wasn't the monster who had poisoned her tea. He was the primary target, and she was the bait used to break him. The relief was immediately swallowed by a cold, sharp terror. If Jinho was innocent, then the vipers were still in the garden, and they were standing closer to him than she ever could. She couldn't run to him yet. To reveal herself now, in the open and defenseless, would be a death sentence for them both. She had to remain the ghost they feared. She had to stay dead long enough to become the weapon he needed, even if he didn't know he was being guarded by a corpse. In the days following the funeral, in the sprawling penthouse that had once been a fortress of absolute authority, transformed into a mausoleum of neglected grief. Jinho, the man whose presence once commanded the silence of entire boardrooms, now sat in the center of the vast living room, shrouded in a darkness that the city's neon lights could not pierce. The silent reaper had become a phantom of himself. He no longer shaved. The sharp, predatory lines of his jaw were buried under a rough, uneven beard, and his eyes, once like polished obsidian, were now bloodshot and vacant. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, his footsteps echoing on the cold marble floors. He had forbidden the staff from touching anything Aisha had left behind. Her silk robe still draped over the velvet armchair. A half-read book lay open on the side table, its pages yellowing in the stagnant air. And in the kitchen, a single ceramic mug remained in the sink, a mundane relic of a morning that should have been like any other. To Jinho, these were not objects, they were the final anchor points of a reality that had drifted out to sea. He spent his hours pouring amber liquid from expensive crystal decanters, not to drink, but to stare into the swirling depths as if the alcohol could offer a reflection of the wife he had failed. He didn't just lose her, he had lost the purpose that made the violence of his life bearable. Without Aisha to come home to, the empire he had bled to build was nothing but a kingdom of dust and ash. Across the city, in a high-rise office that smelled of expensive leather and treachery, the atmosphere was a jarring contrast of triumphant celebration. Kenji, Jinho's cousin and second in command, swirled a glass of vintage scotch, the ice clinking softly, a sound that punctuated his deep satisfaction. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling metropolis as if he were already its undisputed king. Behind him, lounging on a sofa with the grace of a hunting cat, was Hannah. She examined her manicured nails, a cruel, thin smirk playing on her lips. They spoke of Jinho not with reverence, but with a biting, clinical disdain. Reports from the inner circle were consistent. The boss was missing meetings, ignoring the encrypted phones, and letting the shipping routes fall into disarray. To Kenji and Hannah, the grief they witnessed at the cemetery wasn't a sign of humanity, and it was a fatal loss of edge. They laughed at the memory of the great silent reaper reduced to a sobbing mess in the mud, viewing his sorrow as a weakness that justified his removal. Kenji saw the vacuum of power as a long-overdue opportunity. He began moving the assets, whispering to the clan heads about a leader who had grown soft and compromised by a foreign woman's influence. They believed they had committed the perfect crime, convinced that the tiger had been successfully turned into a house cat, broken by the loss of its mate. They sat in their glass tower, toasting to a new era of strength and purity, blissfully unaware that the very corpse they mocked was currently watching them from the shadows of the city. They saw a man drowning in a bottle, never realizing that the rage simmering beneath his grief was a hot, bubbling magma. They had stolen his light, thinking it would leave him blind, but they had only succeeded in forcing him to learn how to hunt in the absolute dark. The penthouse was a tomb of silence, the air heavy with the lingering scent of jasmine and the stale, sharp odor of neglected scotch. Aisha moved through the familiar shadows like a wisp of smoke, her footsteps making no sound on the marble floors she had once paced as a queen. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that threatened to betray her presence. She had bypassed the secondary security nodes with the ease of a woman who had helped design the system. But the true danger wasn't the cameras. It was the man sitting in the dark, a few rooms away. She found him in the living room, a silhouette of broken geometry against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jin-ho was slumped in his chair, a glass dangling from his limp fingers, his eyes fixed on the city lights, as if searching for a ghost in the neon glow of Gangnam. Seeing him this close, the stubble on his jaw and the hollows of his cheeks, Aisha felt a physical ache in her chest. Part of her wanted to scream his name, to bridge the distance and pull him back from the precipice of his own mind. But the cold logic of survival held her back. She needed to know, with absolute certainty, if the man she loved was truly the victim she suspected, or if the silent reaper was merely playing a role to lure her out. She slipped into the master bedroom, a sanctuary that felt like a museum of a dead life. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The half-used bottle of perfume, the silk throw on the bed. He hadn't allowed a single thing to be moved. It was a shrine to his guilt. Aisha reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the silver bracelet, its small camellia charm glinting under the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. She had been wearing this when they took her. She had seen it on her own wrist when she kissed his cold hand goodbye in the hospital, a final silent anchor to the world. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she placed the bracelet precisely in the center of the nightstand, right where he would see it the moment he turned on the lamp. It was a beacon, a question, and a weapon all at once. If he was her enemy, he would see it as a breach of security and double the guards to hunt her down. If he was her husband, it would be the spark that burned down his despair. Aisha retreated into the shadows of the balcony just as the heavy click of the bedroom door echoed through the room. She watched from behind the heavy velvet drapes as Jin-ho stumbled in, his movements heavy and uncoordinated. He didn't turn on the light at first. He sat on the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands, letting out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a dying man's rattle. Then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, he reached out for the lamp. The amber glow flooded the room, and for a heartbeat, time stopped. Jin-ho's gaze fell on the silver camellia. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The glass he was holding slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. But he didn't even flinch. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the cold metal as if afraid it would vanish if he touched it. When he finally picked it up, his knuckles were white, and a sound escaped him. Not a roar, but a soft whimpering, "No," that broke into a sob. From her hiding place, Aisha watched the silent reaper scramble backward, his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and a hope so sharp it was agonizing to witness. He wasn't reaching for his gun to call his soldiers. He was clutching the bracelet to his chest, his head bowed as he wept with a ferocity that shook his entire frame. The test was over. He was not her architect. He was her soul. And he was drowning. Aisha pulled back into the night, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. He was ready. Now, she just had to show him how to fight. The silver bracelet was still clutched in Jin-ho's palm, the camellia charm biting into his skin, a cold reminder that the impossible had entered his sanctuary. The grief that had previously acted as a sedative was suddenly replaced by a frantic, jagged adrenaline. He was no longer a mourning widower. He was a predator who had found a scent in the middle of a wasteland. He moved with a sudden, lethal fluidity, stumbling not from alcohol, but from the sheer velocity of his heartbeat as he lunged toward the hidden alcove behind the master suite's bookshelf. The security room was a cold, windowless box filled with the low hum of servers and the flickering blue light of a dozen monitors. Jin-ho's fingers, which had been shaking moments ago, now flew across the mechanical keyboard with the muscle memory of a man who had built an empire on information. He needed to see the monster who had broken into his home. He needed to see the hand that had placed that bracelet on his nightstand. He pulled up the surveillance logs for the last 3 hours, his jaw set in a hard, grim line, but the screens offered him only a digital void. The footage didn't show an intruder. It didn't show anyone at all. The timestamps flickered and jumped, looping the image of an empty hallway over and over with a precision that chilled his blood. This wasn't a glitch. It was a masterpiece of infiltration. Someone had not only bypassed the physical guards, but had surgically removed themselves from the digital memory of the building. "Show yourself," he hissed into the empty room, his voice raw and animalistic. He felt the phantom weight of a trap closing around him. He scrambled to the administrative logs looking for the breach, for the signature of the hacker who had made a mockery of his military-grade encryption. He scrolled through the lines of green code, his eyes searching for a name, a rival's handle, anything to point his rage toward. Then, his breath hitched. The screen froze on a single entry. System override authorized. Beneath it, flashing with an innocuous, steady pulse, was the user ID, Aisha_P. Jin-Ho felt the air leave his lungs. It was her private override code, a sequence of numbers based on the geographic coordinates of the specific park bench where they had shared their first kiss years ago. It was a secret she had never written down, a piece of digital intimacy that lived only in her mind and the deepest core of his server. A ghost could not type. A ghost could not bypass a firewall using the coordinates of a kiss. The impossibility of the situation warred with the tangible evidence before him. He slumped back into the leather chair, the gun he had drawn slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the desk. He stared at the name on the screen until the edges of his vision began to blur. Before he could spiral back into the abyss of his own confusion, a new notification flared to life on the center monitor. A single encrypted text file sat on the desktop, its title a sharp, biblical provocation, Lazarus. With a hand that felt disconnected from his body, Jin-Ho clicked the icon. The file didn't contain a video or a long explanation. It was a brief message, written in the archaic, shifting cipher they had used when they were first dating, hiding from his father's spies and the watchful eyes of the syndicate. The old iron mill. Midnight. Come alone, or I stay dead forever. The hope that bloomed in his chest was agonizing, as sharp and invasive as a blade between the ribs. His instincts, honed by a decade of survival among vipers, screamed that this was a trap set by Kenji or a rival gang to finish off a broken leader. But as he looked at the silver bracelet on the desk and the green light of her name on the screen, he realized he didn't care. If it was a trap, he would walk into the fire and take the whole city down with him. If it was her, the world was about to end for everyone who had touched her. The old iron mill sat on the skeletal fringes of Seoul, a rusted relic of a forgotten industrial age that seemed to groan under the weight of the humid night air. It was a cathedral of jagged metal and rotting timber, where the moonlight filtered through the holes in the corrugated roof like pale, ghostly fingers. Jin-Ho approached on foot, moving through the waist-high grass with the predatory silence of a man who had long ago traded his soul for survival. He had parked his car miles away, his hand never straying far from the cold steel of the weapon at his hip, his senses dialed to an agonizing frequency. Every snap of a dry twig, every whistle of the wind through the hollow turbines, sounded like the click of a sniper's trigger. He stepped into the main hangar, the vastness of the space swallowing the sound of his breathing. The air here smelled of wet rust and old oil, a scent that felt like the decay of his own life. "I'm here!" he roared, his voice echoing off the high metal rafters, raw and jagged with a desperate, terrifying hope. For a long moment there was no answer. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that threatened to collapse his lungs. Then, from behind the massive shadow of a dormant furnace, a figure emerged. She moved with a cautious, familiar grace, dressed in a dark trench coat that bled into the surrounding gloom. For a heartbeat, Jin-Ho froze, his breath catching in a throat that felt constricted by wire. He didn't raise his gun. He couldn't. His strength, his authority, his very identity as the Silent Reaper evaporated, leaving behind only the shattered man who had knelt in the mud. The figure stepped into a pool of silver moonlight and removed her cap. Aisha looked pale, her features sharpened by the ordeal, a fading bruise tracing the line of her jaw like a brand of her survival. But she was breathing. The reality of her presence hit Jin-ho with the force of a physical blow, staggering him. He didn't run to her. He couldn't move his legs, which felt as though they had been turned to stone. Aisha, he whispered, the name breaking on his lips like a prayer and a sob combined. She closed the distance in a blurred rush, colliding with him with a desperate strength that nearly knocked him back. As her arms wrapped around his neck, the warmth of her body and the scent of her skin, vanilla and the faint metallic tang of the mill, shattered his paralysis. He crushed her to him, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his large hands trembling as they gripped her coat. He fell to his knees, dragging her down into the dirt with him, unable to stand under the crushing weight of his relief. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs frantically brushing away the tears that spilled from her eyes, tracing the contours of her cheeks as if memorizing a miracle. "I saw you," he choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. "I touched your hand in the casket. You were cold, Aisha. You were gone." "It was a drug," she whispered back, her voice trembling but fierce, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "Tetrodotoxin. They intended to bury me alive, Jin-ho. I heard them. I was trapped in my own skin, and I heard Kenji and Hannah laughing about how they were going to take the throne once you were broken." The mention of his cousin's name acted like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The husband who had been weeping a moment ago died in that instant. Jin-ho's expression shifted with a terrifying clinical speed. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by a cold, abyssal darkness that Aisha had only ever seen from a distance. His jaw set into a mask of granite. The king of the underworld was reborn in the dirt of the mill, but this time he was fueled by something more potent than greed. "Kenji," Jin-ho repeated, the name tasting like ash and bile. "He stood beside me at the grave. He handed me the shovel." He looked at Aisha, his eyes no longer vacant but burning with a lethal, focused light. The reunion was over. The war had begun. The following week was a masterclass in psychological demolition. A silent war waged from the flickering shadows of a city that believed its queen was ash. In the light of day, Jin-ho played his part with a haunting, dedicated precision. He appeared in the syndicate's satellite offices looking like a man haunted by ghosts, his eyes sunken and his movements erratic. He allowed rumors to fester like an open wound, whispers that the Silent Reaper was finally losing his mind to the bottle. He was the perfect distraction, a wounded titan drawing all eyes, while the real blade moved unseen in the dark. From the sub-basement of a secure safe house, Aisha became the ghost in the machine. Her fingers danced across encrypted servers, her sharp intellect finally weaponized against the men who had treated her as a liability. She didn't just attack their finances, she attacked their sanity. It began with the money, the lifeblood of the coup. Kenji and Hannah watched in paralyzed horror as offshore accounts, intended to fund their new era, began to bleed out. Millions of dollars vanished into digital ether, reappearing as massive donations to charities in Aisha's name. It was a signature, a phantom thumbprint left on their ledgers that made the air in their high-rise offices turn cold. Then came the personal hauntings, the surgical strikes designed to rot their composure from the inside out. Hannah returned to her penthouse one evening to find the atmosphere heavy with a familiar, sickeningly sweet scent. The red light of the city filtered into her living room, illuminating a scene of calculated chaos. Her priceless collection of vintage wine had been systematically shattered, the crimson liquid pooling on the white marble floor like a fresh lake of blood. In the center of the wreckage, untouched and steaming, sat a single cup of herbal tea. The exact blend Hannah had laced with poison a week prior. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprint in the blood, only the tea, mocking her with its warmth. Hannah's scream echoed through the building, but when her guards arrived, they found nothing but the scent of jasmine lingering in the vents. Kenji fared no better. He was a man of iron logic, but logic offered no protection against the impossible. He emerged from a secret meeting to find his bulletproof sedan, parked in a high-security garage, transformed into a funeral parlor. The cabin was stuffed to the roof with hundreds of fresh white lilies, their heavy funereal perfume so thick it was suffocating. Pressed against the driver's side window was a copy of the eulogy he had delivered at Aisha's empty grave. Certain words had been circled in blood-red ink: loyalty, family, forever. When he checked the security footage, the screen showed only 60 minutes of gray static during the exact hour the car had been filled. Jin-ho and Aisha coordinated every move like a symphony of vengeance. By day, Jin-ho ignored Kenji's calls, feigning a drunken stupor that lured his cousin into a false sense of predatory confidence. By night, he met Aisha in the flickering light of the safe house, where they traded intelligence like a new form of intimacy. The fear was working. The conspirators began to look at their own shadows with dread, their partnership fraying under the weight of a haunting they couldn't explain. They believed they were being hunted by a memory, never realizing that the memory had teeth, and it was currently closing around their throats. The grand hall of the syndicate's headquarters was a cathedral of gold and crimson, a space designed to intimidate through opulence and the heavy, silent presence of 50 of the most dangerous men in Korea. And it was the night of the monthly banquet, but the air was devoid of celebration. It was thick with the scent of an impending execution. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Jin-ho, appearing gaunt and vacant, his gaze fixed on the bottom of a water glass as if he were a king, already deposed by his own grief. To his right, Kenji stood with the radiating arrogance of a successor, smoothing his silk tie and preparing to call for the vote of no confidence that would finalize his coup. "Brothers," Kenji began, his voice projecting a false, heavy-hearted strength that carried to the back of the hall. "We gather in a time of mourning, but the family cannot be ruled by a shadow. Our leader is unwell. His judgment has been compromised by a tragedy we all share." He paused, casting a look of mock pity toward the silent Jin-ho. Hannah sat beside him, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows of the room, her composure brittle despite her sharp, predatory smile. "I propose a new direction, a restructuring to restore the iron we have lost." Suddenly the lights flickered and died, plunging the opulent hall into a terrifying, absolute blackness. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by the metallic click of dozens of guns being cocked in the dark. Kenji's voice cracked as he shouted for the backup generators, but the lights did not return. Instead, the massive digital screen behind the head table flared to life, casting a ghostly blue glow over the assembly. It wasn't a financial presentation. It was grainy, hidden camera footage from inside a hospital morgue. The room went deathly silent as the audio played. Kenji's voice, cold and mocking. "We're discussing how easy it had been to remove the foreigner while standing over a sheeted body." Before the conspirators could process the betrayal of their own secrets, the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a slow, grinding groan. From the darkness of the corridor emerged a silhouette that made the blood drain from 50 hardened faces. Aisha stepped into the light, but she was not the ghost they had manufactured. She was dressed in a gown of crimson silk that flowed around her like liquid fire, a stark, violent contrast to the sea of black suits. Her hair was a dark cascade down her back, and her face was a mask of imperious, divine judgment. She walked down the center aisle, the rhythmic clicking of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. The clan heads parted instinctively, shrinking back from a woman they believed had been turned to ash. When she reached the head table, she didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Kenji, who was trembling so violently he had to grip the table to stand. Aisha reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the silver camellia bracelet, tossing it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud, the sound of a gavel. "You returned this to my husband to break him," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "Instead, you gave him the map to find me." Jinho stood up then, the transition so fluid and lethal it was as if he had shed a second skin. He was no longer the mourning widower. He was the king of the underworld, his eyes dark voids of absolute authority. He placed a hand on the small of Aisha's back, a gesture of possession that signaled the end of the coup. "You thought love made me weak," Jinho whispered, leaning in close to Kenji. "But you forgot the first rule of our blood. We don't just survive tragedy, we weaponize it." At a sharp signal, the loyalist guards emerged from the periphery. There was no public execution. That was too messy for a hall of this stature. Hannah was dragged away in a state of incoherent hysteria, while Kenji was lifted from his chair, his pleas for family mercy falling on ears of stone. They were simply erased, removed from the room as if they were a stain on the marble. As the doors closed behind the traitors, Jinho turned back to the assembly. The clan heads lowered their heads in a unified, terrifying bow of respect, acknowledging that the dynasty had not ended. It had been forged into something unbreakable. The first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the Seoul skyline, filtering through a heavy mist that clung to the ground of the private cemetery like a lingering shroud. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and ancient undisturbed sorrow. Jinho and Aisha stood once more before the fresh grave, the one that bore her name in elegant, mocking gold leaf. The white lilies Jinho had left there during his week of madness were now wilted and brown, a decaying testament to a grief that had been rendered obsolete. The sight of her own name carved into the granite was surreal for Aisha, a jarring reminder of the void she had narrowly escaped. She shivered, not from the biting morning chill, but from the phantom memory of the morgue's silence and the suffocating weight of the darkness. Jinho sensed the tremor and immediately stripped off his heavy wool overcoat, draping it over her shoulders. It was warm, carrying the scent that had always defined her safety: cedar, expensive tobacco, and rain. "It feels strange," she whispered, her fingers tracing the polished edges of the stone that claimed she was dead. "To look at my own end while I am still standing." Jinho stepped up beside her, his face set in a grim, immovable line. In his grip was a heavy sledgehammer, a tool of destruction he had taken from the groundskeeper's shed on their way through the gates. "This is not your end," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a primal authority. "This is a lie manufactured by cowards, and I am done living with lies." He stepped forward, the muscles in his back bunching beneath his silk shirt as he swung the hammer in a wide, powerful arc. The sound of metal striking granite cracked through the silent cemetery like a thunderclap, echoing off the distant mausoleums. A spiderweb of fractures instantly blossomed across the stone. He struck it again and again, each blow fueled by the agony of the last week, the terror of the highway explosion, and the sheer rage of the betrayal. He wasn't just breaking a piece of rock. He was shattering the timeline where he had lost her. Chunks of granite flew into the grass, obliterating the name Aisha and erasing the dates of her false death. He didn't stop until the headstone was reduced to a pile of unrecognizable rubble, a broken monument to a tragedy that had been averted by fire and blood. When he finally finished, he dropped the hammer into the mud, his chest heaving, his palms raw. The wildness in his eyes faded, replaced by a fierce, protective tenderness as he turned back to her. "You are not buried here," he said, pulling her into his arms and crushing her against his heartbeat. "You are here, with me, and as long as I draw breath, you will never be a ghost again." Aisha buried her face in his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart. the same rhythm that had acted as her North Star through the darkness of her paralysis. The weight of the past week began to lift, replaced by a cold, shared resolve. They had been forged in a fire that should have consumed them, and they had emerged as something harder, something lethal. "Where do we go now?" she asked, looking up at the man who had reclaimed his throne. "The world knows I have returned. The game is different now." Jinho looked out over the mist toward the city, where the sun was finally breaking through the clouds in long golden rays. The empire was secure, the vipers had been purged, and the crown was heavier than ever. "We don't hide anymore, Aisha," he replied, interlacing his fingers with hers, his grip sealing a new, unbreakable pact. "We build. We take everything they tried to steal from us, and we make it a fortress." They turned their backs on the ruined grave and the ghosts of the night, walking hand in hand toward the iron gates. As they stepped out of the cemetery and into the light of a new day, the Silent Reaper and his Crimson Queen moved as one, an invincible duo ready to set the world on fire.